Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into something pretty wild. How a single, controversial marriage way back in the 7th century ended up completely changing the definition of family for more than a billion people today. Seriously.
All right, so how on earth does that happen? Well, it all kicks off with a marriage that was, let's just say, a huge deal at the time. So controversial, in fact, that it took a divine revelation to make it okay. And that one act, it created a legal ripple effect that we're still seeing today.
So we're talking about the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad to a woman named Zaynab bint Jahsh. Now what's the big deal? Well, Zaynab was the ex-wife of his adopted son. And that right there is where everything gets complicated.
Okay, to really get why this was such a bombshell, we need to get to know the three people at the center of this storm. First, you've got the Prophet Muhammad himself. Then, there's his adopted son, Zayd ibn Harithah. And Zayd wasn't just any son, he was incredibly close to Muhammad. So close, he's the only one of the Prophet's companions who's actually named in the Qur'an. And finally, there's Zaynab, who was Zayd's wife.
And here's the piece of the puzzle you absolutely have to understand. Back then, in that part of the world, adoption wasn't just a casual thing. It was a huge, binding commitment. I mean, an adopted son was, for all intents and purposes, a real son. He took the family name, he was in line for inheritance, everything. So Zayd wasn't just some kid Muhammad was fond of. Nope, he was known everywhere as Zayd ibn Muhammad, Zayd the son of Muhammad, period. So when Muhammad married Zaynab, his own adopted son's ex-wife, this wasn't just raising a few eyebrows. This was an earthquake. It didn't just break a social rule, it set off a chain reaction that completely rewrote the legal definition of adoption in Islam. Just look at this comparison. It shows you exactly how massive this change was. I mean, it's a total 180. An adopted child went from being a legal, real son with a name and inheritance to basically a ward. And the whole reason this started, the taboo around marrying your adopted son's ex-wife, not only was it broken, it was now officially sanctioned. The old way of doing things was completely thrown out.
And they weren't messing around with this new rule. This quote from a hadith really drives home how serious it was. It basically says that if you claim to be the son of someone who isn't your biological father, you're booking yourself a spot in hell. So keeping your own family name wasn't just a suggestion anymore. It became a core part of the faith. A really, really big deal.
Okay, so what does all this history mean for people today?
Well, these rules from the 7th century create some very real, very tricky situations for Muslim families who want to adopt. For example, an adopted child isn't considered maharam. That's a close blood relative you can't marry. That can create some awkward social situations down the line. Inheritance isn't automatic either. It's so complex that some families look for creative workarounds, like something called foster breastfeeding, just to create a legally recognized family bond.
Which, of course, brings us back to the big question. Why? Why would you blow up a social custom that was totally normal and accepted? Why make such a drastic change? The historical sources actually give us a couple of explanations that are kind of tangled together.
All right, let's start with the main official reason. This one comes straight from the top, from the Qur'an itself.
So the theological angle is this. The marriage had nothing to do with personal feelings. It was a direct command from God. And the whole point was to prove a point, to set a precedent. It was meant to show everyone that the old cultural idea of an adopted son being the same as a biological one was just, well, a human superstition that God wanted to correct for good. And this verse right here is the bedrock for that whole argument. It lays it out pretty clearly. It says that God arranged the marriage so that, from then on, believers wouldn't feel any blame for marrying the ex-wives of their adopted sons. The marriage itself was basically a living, breathing, legal announcement. What's really interesting, though, is that the verse also hints at something very human. It says Muhammad hesitated. He was worried about what people would think, the public backlash. Marrying the ex-wife of the man everyone called your son, that was a huge taboo. The text says he was considering the people, but in the end, God's command was what mattered most. But that's not the only story out there. Let's peel back another layer, shall we? This version adds a much more personal element, and it comes from the earliest Islamic historians.
See, the first people who wrote about the Prophet's life, guys like al-Tabari and Ibn Sa'd, they told a story with a more personal angle. It's a version of events that, as time went on, made later scholars pretty uncomfortable, to the point where some tried to argue it never even happened.
So this earlier telling goes something like this. Muhammad drops by Zayd's house one day, but Zayd isn't home. Instead, he sees Zaynab and is just floored by her beauty. When Zayd finds out about this, he actually offers to divorce Zaynab so the Prophet can marry her. And at first, Muhammad says no, telling him, keep your wife, which sounds a lot like that fear of public opinion we just talked about. But the divorce goes through anyway, and then the Quranic verse comes down sanctioning the marriage.
The journey of this particular story through history is fascinating in itself. You have it right there in the earliest, most respected sources, like El-Tabari. But fast forward a few centuries, and scholars start getting really squeamish about the whole idea. The suggestion that the Prophet might have been motivated by, seeing a beautiful woman just didn't sit right. A much later scholar, Ibn Kathir, basically just says, yeah, there are some stories in the old books I'd rather not talk about. And today? Many modern scholars will tell you the whole personal story is a complete fabrication.
So, look, whether you see this as being driven purely by a divine command to fix an old custom, or by a more human story of attraction, or maybe some mix of the two, the end result is exactly the same. Islamic law was changed forever.
And this really breaks down that chain of events perfectly. You start with a powerful social taboo. Then, the Prophet himself does something that shatters it. A divine revelation comes down to explain why it had to happen. And boom, the legal status of an adopted son is erased, and family law in Islam takes a hard right turn.
And really, that's the bottom line here. This single, incredibly controversial marriage, explained and justified by divine revelation, didn't just add a new rule to the books. It fundamentally tore down an existing idea of what family meant and built something completely new in its place, a new definition that's still shaping families around the world.
It all leaves you with a pretty deep question to chew on, right? When you have a moment in history like this, where a very human story gets wrapped up in a divine explanation, how do we even begin to draw the line between the personal and the divine? Where does one end and the other begin?